Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about some really interesting research on food allergies. You sent us a paper about making cashews and pistachios safer for people who are allergic to them.
Yeah, this is really exciting stuff.
It is, right?
It was published just recently, actually, on October 28th of last year, 2024, in the journal Foods. The title is a bit of a mouthful, though. Development of Cashew and Pistachio Ladders Through a Food Processing Approach.
Wow. Okay, so that's helpful for our listeners.
Well, hopefully the conversation is more interesting than the title. The authors are Nicki Shwe, Hoika Meng, Jingjing Zeng, Jinjing Bao, Dianne Campbell, Paul Turner, and Nanju Alice Lee.
Okay, so those are some names to remember, but I'm really interested to hear more about this because I know from the notes that you sent me that cashew and pistachio allergies, they're a big deal, right? They're on the rise and they're really hard to avoid.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. These nuts are everywhere. You find them in trail mixes, in baked goods, in Asian cuisine, all sorts of things.
Exactly. And it's not like you can just, pick them out easily like you can with some other allergens.
Right. And that's why the current approach is basically strict avoidance, which, let's be honest, it's really hard to maintain.
Yeah, it is. And what about treatments? Are there any good treatments out there?
Well, there are some advancements, like we've seen the recent FDA approval of omalizumab. That's an anti-IgE antibody,
Okay.
but it's not a cure.
Right. It's more about managing the reaction if it happens, right?
Yeah.
Not preventing it in the first place.
Exactly.
What about oral immunotherapy? I've heard a bit about that.
Ah, OIT. That's a promising area.
Yeah.
But it involves gradually exposing people to the allergens, so there's some risk involved.
Yeah. I can see how that could be scary for people.
And that's where this idea of the allergen ladder comes in. It builds on the success of something called the BOPI trial, which used boiled peanuts to desensitize people to peanut allergies.
Boiled peanuts. That's interesting. So this new research is looking at doing something similar with cashews and pistachios.
Exactly. It's focusing on how soaking and boiling might affect the proteins that cause these allergic reactions.
So the idea is that if you boil the nuts, you can change those proteins somehow and make them less likely to trigger an allergic reaction.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm following you. So what did they find? Does boiling actually work?
Well, one surprising finding was that soaking didn't really do much. They used a technique called SDS-PAGE, which basically separates proteins by size, and there wasn't much difference between soaked and unsoaked nuts.
Huh. So soaking is out. What about boiling?
Boiling had a much more noticeable effect. When they boiled the nuts for longer periods, like 1 to 4 hours, they saw a big drop in the amount of extractable protein.
So less protein overall after boiling.
Right. And that suggests that the heat is changing the structure of the proteins, making them less soluble.
Okay, that makes sense. But does that actually translate to less of an allergic reaction? How did they measure that?
They used a bunch of different techniques, which is really cool. One was something called an inhibition ELISAR. It's spelled ELISA, but it's pronounced ELISAR. And basically, it measures how well the boiled proteins can block the binding of antibodies that are specific to cashew and pistachio allergens.
Wait, can you break that down a bit for me?
Yeah.
So antibodies are what cause the allergic reaction, right?
Right, specifically IgE antibodies. They bind to the allergens and trigger the whole immune response.
Okay, so is the idea that the boiled proteins are sort of getting in the way of those antibodies, like preventing them from binding to the regular nut proteins?
You got it. It's like a competition for binding sites.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And did they see that happening? Were the boiled proteins blocking those antibodies?
Yes. The results show that the boiled proteins were really good at blocking the antibody binding, which means they were less allergenic.
That's pretty amazing. So boiling actually seems to make these nuts less recognizable to the immune system.
Exactly. And they confirmed these findings using a few other techniques, like IgE immunoblots and dot blots.
Can you explain those a bit?
Sure. IgE immunoblots and dot blots specifically look at those IgE antibodies we were talking about, the ones that cause the allergic reactions. So in an immunoblot, you first separate the proteins by their size. Then you transfer those proteins onto a special membrane. And then you basically expose that membrane to serum from people who are allergic to cashews or pistachios.
Okay, so you're using the blood from people with allergies to see if it reacts to the proteins on that membrane.
Right. And if those IgE antibodies in the blood bind to the proteins on the membrane, you'll see a visible band. The darker the band, the more IgE binding is happening.
So if boiling is working, you would expect to see lighter bands, right? Because there's less IgE binding.
Exactly. And that's exactly what they found, especially when they boiled the nuts for longer periods. They saw a significant reduction in the intensity of those bands, which visually confirms that there's less IgE binding happening.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So it seems like boiling is definitely doing something to make these nuts less allergenic. But did they see any difference between cashews and pistachios? Did one react differently to the boiling than the other?
Actually, yeah. They found that pistachio proteins seem to be more sensitive to the boiling than cashew proteins.
Interesting.
They saw a bigger decrease in both the protein concentration and the IgE binding with pistachios.
Huh. So pistachios might be easier to modify for this allergen ladder approach then.
It's definitely possible. And they also found something else that was pretty surprising.
What's that?
Roasting, which is how most people prepare these nuts, actually seemed to make them more allergenic.
Seriously. Roasting makes them worse.
It seems that way, at least according to their findings. It's definitely something that needs more research. But it just goes to show how complicated this whole relationship between food processing and allergenicity really is.
It really does. And I think it's important to mention that this was a lab study. All right. So there are some limitations to what we can conclude from it. Before we get too carried away with all these exciting possibilities, we need to be realistic about what this study can and can't tell us.
You're absolutely right. We need more research to confirm these findings and to see how they play out in the real world.
So before we get ahead of ourselves and start boiling all our nuts, let's talk about those limitations. What are some of the key things to keep in mind?
Well, one thing is the sample size. This study was relatively small. We need larger studies to really validate these findings.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else? Another thing is that they didn't have serum from people who were specifically allergic to pistachios. They mostly used serum from people with cashew allergies and some polyclonal antibodies that react with both cashew and pistachio proteins.
So while they saw some promising results with the pistachio proteins, it would be good to confirm those results using serum from people who actually have pistachio allergies.
Precisely. And we also can't assume that these findings will automatically apply to other types of tree nuts. Each nut has its own unique set of allergens.
Right, more research is definitely needed to see how boiling affects those other tree nuts. It seems like we're just scratching the surface here, but it's a really exciting start.
I agree. This research lays a great foundation for future studies.
Absolutely, and it's really encouraging to see this kind of innovative thinking around food allergies. It gives me hope that maybe someday people with these allergies won't have to live in fear of accidental exposure.
I'm hopeful too. It's all about shifting the focus from avoidance to actually addressing the root cause of the allergy.
Well said. I am incredibly eager to hear more about the potential applications of this research. So let's continue this conversation in part 2, where we'll dive into what this might mean for people with cashew and pistachio allergies in the real world. Welcome back to our deep dive on making cashews and pistachios safer to eat. I'm really fascinated by this whole idea of boiling them to change the proteins.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple concept, but the science behind it is super interesting.
It is. But before we get too deep into the how, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say the elephant in the nut bowl? Cross-reactivity.
Ah, yes, cross-reactivity. That definitely adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
Right. Because if someone's allergic to cashews, they might also be allergic to pistachios.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Exactly. It's all because they're from the same botanical family, Anacardiaceae.
Okay, so they're like cousins?
Yeah, you could say that. And because they're related, they have some similar proteins. So someone's immune system might see those similar proteins in both nuts and react to both.
That makes sense. So if you're diagnosing someone with a cashew allergy, you'd automatically test for pistachio allergy too, right?
Absolutely. You wouldn't want to assume someone's safe just because they haven't had a reaction yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how does this cross-reactivity play into the research we're talking about? The boiling and all that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. They use these things called polyclonal antibodies, which can basically bind to multiple targets. And they found that the antibodies specific to cashew proteins also reacted with pistachio proteins.
Hold on, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. So the antibodies couldn't tell the difference between the cashew and pistachio proteins?
Pretty much.
That's crazy. So even though the nuts are different, the antibodies see them as the same thing.
Kind of, yeah. And what's even cooler is that they saw similar reductions in antibody binding for both the cashew and pistachio proteins after they boiled them.
Wait, really? So boiling is affecting both nuts in the same way, even though they have different allergens?
It seems that way, which means a single boiling process could potentially work for both cashew and pistachio OIT.
Wow, that's amazing. You wouldn't need separate treatments for each nut.
Right, it could simplify things a lot. especially for people who are allergic to both.
That makes so much sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that pistachios seem to be more sensitive to boiling than cashews. Does that mean you'd need to boil them for less time to get the same effect?
That's a great question, and it's definitely possible. We need more research to figure out the optimal boiling time for each nut, but it's an important consideration for sure.
Yeah, you don't want to end up with mushy nuts that nobody wants to eat.
Exactly. Taste and texture are important, especially if you're trying to encourage people to actually do this OIT thing.
It would be amazing if you could boil the nuts and then, like, roast them or something to make them taste better.
I know, right? That would be a game changer. Imagine having a boiled nut mix that's actually delicious.
Sign me up. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about cashews and pistachios, but is this cross-reactivity thing just limited to nuts?
Not at all. It's actually pretty common in food allergies. Like, have you ever heard of pollen food allergy syndrome?
Hmm, that sounds familiar, but I don't really know much about it.
It's where people who are allergic to certain pollens also react to certain fruits and vegetables.
Really? Like what?
A classic example is birch pollen and apples. Some people who are allergic to birch pollen get itchy mouths or even swelling when they eat apples.
That's weird. Why would that happen?
It's because apples have some proteins that are similar to the proteins in birch pollen.
So their body thinks they're eating pollen when they're actually eating an apple.
Exactly. It's all about those similar proteins causing confusion in the immune system.
Wow, I had no idea. So this cross-reactivity is something to be aware of with all sorts of allergies, not just nut allergies.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to work with a qualified allergist who can help you figure out all your potential cross-reactivities.
Okay, so this is all starting to make a lot more sense. But before we dive into what this boiling research might mean for people in the real world, I think it would be helpful to understand how they actually figure out this cross-reactivity stuff. Like, how do they know that two foods are going to cross-react?
You're right. Understanding the how is super important. So there are a few different ways they can do this. One is by looking at the actual protein sequences of different allergens.
The protein sequence.
Yeah, like the amino acids that make up the protein. If two foods have allergens with very similar amino acid sequences, then there's a higher chance they'll cross-react.
Okay, so it's like comparing blueprints. If the blueprints are similar, the buildings will look alike.
That's a great analogy. And then there are also some lab tests they can do using antibodies and stuff.
Like those ELISAs you were talking about before.
Yeah. They can basically test whether an antibody that binds to one allergen will also bind to another allergen.
So if the same key can unlock two different doors, it means the doors are probably pretty similar.
Exactly. And they can also use blood serum from people with allergies to test for cross-reactivity. Like, they could take serum from someone with a known cashew allergy and expose it to pistachio proteins.
And if they see a reaction, that means there's cross-reactivity.
Right. It's all about looking for clues and connections.
It really is. This is so fascinating. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about cross-reactivity, how they figure it out, and how it all relates to this boiling research. But now I'm really curious to hear what all of this might mean for people with cashew and pistachio allergies in the real world. Like, what are the actual applications of this research?
That's the big question, right? And we're going to get to that. But first, we need a little break. We'll be back soon to explore all the amazing possibilities.
All right, we're back and ready to dive into the real-world applications of this boiling research. I'm so curious to hear what you think this could mean for people with cashew and pistachio allergies.
Well, I think the most immediate application is in oral immunotherapy, or OIT, as we've been calling it.
Right, using those boiled nuts to create that allergen ladder.
Exactly. Imagine a world where people could actually, eat cashews and pistachios again, safely, under the care of their allergist, of course.
It's a huge shift in thinking, isn't it? From avoiding these nuts completely to actually incorporating them into your diet as part of the treatment plan.
It really is. And the beauty of OIT is that it's not just about managing symptoms, it's about retraining the immune system.
Like teaching your body to not freak out when it encounters these nuts.
Exactly. And I think this boiling approach could make OIT even safer because you're starting with a less potent form of the allergen.
That makes a lot of sense. So fewer scary reactions during treatment. But what about beyond OIT? Could this lead to like hypoallergenic cashew and pistachio products?
I think that's a real possibility. I mean, imagine being able to buy cashew butter or pistachio ice cream that's safe for people with allergies.
Oh my gosh, that would be a dream. No more scouring ingredient labels and worrying about cross-contamination.
Exactly. It would give people so much more freedom and choice.
Now, you mentioned earlier that even shorter boiling time showed some reduction in allergenicity.
Oh,
So maybe it wouldn't even have to be, like, extensively boiled nuts in these products.
right. It could be a much more subtle process, like maybe a quick blanch before adding the nuts to a recipe.
It's fascinating to think about all the possibilities. But realistically, are food companies going to be willing to invest in this? I mean, it seems like it could get expensive to change their processes.
It's a valid concern, but I think as the demand for allergen-friendly foods continues to grow, we'll see more companies jumping on board. It's a huge market.
That's true. And the more people demand these options, the more likely companies are to make them available.
Exactly. It's all about consumer power.
I love that. So we've got OIT, we've got hypoallergenic foods. What else? Any other potential applications you can think of?
Well, this is where things get really exciting. The researchers found that boiling can actually change the structure of those allergenic proteins in a way that might make them useful for other things like pharmaceuticals or even cosmetics.
Wait, seriously? Boiled cashew protein in a medication? Or pistachio oil in a face cream?
I know it sounds wild, but it's not totally out there. It's like they've taken these allergens and turned them into something completely different.
That's incredible. This research really is opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
It really is. It just goes to show that sometimes the simplest solutions can have the most profound impact.
Well said. I feel like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. From the science behind boiling these nuts to all the potential applications, I'm walking away from this conversation feeling incredibly hopeful for the future of food allergy treatment.
Me too. It's an exciting time to be in this field. There's so much potential for innovation and discovery.
It's all about moving from a place of fear and restriction to a place of, like, empowerment and possibility.
Exactly. And that's what I love about science. It's all about pushing boundaries and finding new ways to make the world a better place.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure exploring this research with you.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. Until next time, stay curious.